tonight. Mr. O'Malley at least had asked about perhaps live streaming this, and I think maybe if it's helpful to somebody, then maybe somebody else can watch in and it'd be beneficial to them. I don't know that
y'all don't get any big ideas about staying home and not having to come.
Right. I'm not sure that I have as much as I would like to offer on subjects like this because there's, like we may mention last week with the canon, there's so many layers to those questions. And at least in part, I find myself, and maybe you feel this way, I find myself having to take the word of a lot of people, and so I try to find people who, on other things, I find that prove to be trustworthy, and at least present a case for the evidence and how to explain. But then, in some point, in some of these questions, like when we're looking at manuscript variations or something like that, I'm just having to take people's word for it that that's the number and that that's how this works and all of that. I do think there are some very good resources out there for careful study of this. But ultimately, I don't have the capacity to go and look at, P52 manuscript, which is how they number manuscripts. Well, I don't know where P comes, but I don't have the ability to go look at P52 and compare it to P75 and look at the differences. I mean, I can barely read English, much less Greek with all these manuscripts and all that. So, and there's technology that's involved in this. I mean, they use ultraviolet lights. Think about this. They use ultraviolet lights to look at manuscripts so that they can see if there have been corrections and change. I don't have an ultraviolet light at home. I can't.
You don't have the manuscript to look at.
I don't have the manuscript to look at, and I don't have lights to use. So, all that is to say, now, for people who make this their study, they are making a lot of these resources available. There's a nonprofit organization who has made it their mission to go around the world and take pictures of every manuscript of the New Testament available. You can go on their website. You can look at scans and high-resolution pictures of these manuscripts. So it's not like they're trying to hide anything. It's not like they're trying to, scoot anything in under the rug or whatever the saying is. But what I'm saying is that I'm limited in my capacity of using all this. I'm not a scholar. And I'm not, in some of this, it's even difficult to understand exactly what all the scholars are saying. However, I think we can give some confidence about the New Testament. Like last week with the canon, I think there are very good reasons to accept that the reason that we have these books there's some basic truths that work here. And so what I want to do, what we'd like to do today is talk about, so if we've got the right books, do we know what Luke actually wrote when he wrote it down? Do we know what Paul wrote when he wrote Ephesians? Do we have what Paul wrote when he wrote that book? And I think we'll focus mostly on the New Testament. I think that's where most of the discussions are.
I have a little bit I want to say about the Old Testament.
That'd be great. Yeah.
So here's where this is the reason that this kind of study first caught my attention. First of all, y'all have heard of Aristotle, right? You ever had any class where you learned anything about Aristotle? Socrates? Any of the Roman or Greek philosophers? All right, I took some college classes in which we looked at some of those. I don't ever remember a college professor saying, "Now look, we are basing this, what we know about Aristotle and what we believe that he wrote, we're basing this on manuscripts. And those manuscripts have thousands of variants in it, and there's really no way we can be sure that these haven't been redacted or edited through the centuries. And so we really can't be sure what Aristotle said. These are legends of what Aristotle said." I've never heard a professor say that. But I've read article after article of people saying that about the Bible, that we can't be certain of what the Bible said. We don't know how many changes have been made. And so when I first became a Christian and I was looking at this and thinking about this, I mean, that was really disturbing to me. Because here are the things that are said. Number one, we don't have the originals. All right, so nobody anywhere that we know of has the copy that Paul signed his name on, the autograph. of it. And so what we have copies. And we probably don't even have copies of the autograph. We probably have copies of copies of copies of the autograph. And so do you ever remember playing, have you ever played the game Broken Phone Line, or it has a lot of different names, where you get a bunch of people and somebody whispers a message in one person's ear, and then they whisper it in another person's ear, and so forth and so forth. And after it's gone around about 20 people or so, they say, all right, so what did you hear? And they say something like, blue monkeys drive, salamanders, something like that. I don't know. It didn't make sense to me. And everybody bust out laughing, because the original, what happened is every time it got, somebody didn't whisper it quite clearly enough, and you can't ask questions on it. And so anyway, so that type of thing, we know that happens, that when we are relaying information from some source who relate it from some other source who relate it from some other source, that it can get messed up. And so we know that. And so the argument is, well, how can we have any confidence in what we have today, since we have copies of copies of copies of this? And so that's really disturbing to me. Well, I don't know. I don't know if we do or not. So that prompted me to dig into it a little bit more. And when you dig into it a little bit more, I think there's still going to be some questions on some things. But I think what you will do is you'll have to come to a conclusion. Either we can't know anything about history. I mean, nothing. We can't have confidence in anything that ever happened in history. Or we can look at it and say, well, if we can have confidence about anything that happened in history, then we can certainly have confidence in the Bible. Those are really the two conclusions that I think you're forced to come to when you look at the evidence behind this. So for that reason, we'll kind of investigate. Now, I'm going to give you a few things, or we'll give you a few things that sound really shocking at first. So, like the King James Bible, and a number of our English versions, but particularly the King James Bible, when it was translated, the source that translators used for the Old Testament was Masoretic text. Masoretic text was a group of Jewish scribes that had records of the Old Testament, and the earliest text that they had to translate from, the Masoretic text, was around 1000 AD. Now let that soak in for a minute. 1000 AD. When was the Old Testament originally written? You got a spectrum here, but somebody give me a date. Who wrote the first book in the Bible? Yeah, about what date was that? Anybody have any idea? Think that's going to be too early? Think you're still going to be too early? All right, what about Isaiah? Any idea with Isaiah? David? So we have not done well in our Bible classes at conveying a timeline here of getting this. All right, so let's say we're going to be in the time period of 2000, 1500. Moses is going to be around 1500 or so, a little before the BC. Yes, thank you. Yes, and so all right, so let's think about that. Let's say 1500, just as a round number, and when's the oldest text that we had to translate from? The King James? 1000 AD. So what's the time difference there? 2,500 years. So Moses wrote something down, and 2,500 years later, we find a record. Do you think that any changes could take place in 2,500 years? That sounds like it possibly could. So that's one of the criticisms. How in the world do we not think that there were major changes that took place in that 2,500 year period before the copy that we have? And so we could go back 1,000 years and find a copy, but we need to go back 3,500 years nearly, and to know what the original said. And so that becomes the big, mental block there is, whoa, how can we have confidence in that? So let me tell you some things that I think are significant there. First of all, is there any reason we would have to think that the copying of the scriptures by the Jews may be done in a more careful way than we would play broken phone line. Melissa thinks so. Why do you think they would be more careful with it? They had to pass it down. And what did they think it was? The law. From who? God. All right, so, how careful are you of copying down your grandma's recipe? I mean, well, this is special. We got to pass this down. But what if you think it's the Word of God? What if you think it is truth? Would you be more careful to copy that down? I think so. So we have reason to believe that they would be careful. But the question is, can we prove that they were careful with that? So we need to get into the New Testament. So I'll make this pretty short. In 1947, there was a major archaeological discovery, at least in consideration with biblical text. You know what it was? Can you think of any archaeological discoveries that have made big news? The Dead Sea Scrolls. Very good. The Dead Sea Scrolls. And so what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's say, I think it was like 300 different biblical texts, 230 biblical text manuscripts were found there. Every book of the Bible, every book of the Old Testament, except for Esther, was found there. And they dated it. And they were able to date it between 250 BC to right around 100 AD. All right. Now, what's the oldest text that the King James was translated from? 1000 AD. 1000 AD. Now we're going back to 250 BC. So we're going back another 1,000 years. All right? We have now found a text that is 1,000 years older than the oldest one we had before. How many changes do you think would take place in that 1,000 years? Because remember, the argument was, now wait a minute, if the text that we have, the oldest text we have now, is 2,500 years from distant from the original written, can you imagine how many changes would take place? All right, well, we still haven't been able to go all the way back to the original, but we're able to go back another 1,000 years now. So you would think there'd be a lot of changes, right? But there wasn't. And so when they began to look at these texts, they were like 99.5% accurate all the way through, like word for word accurate. And so a lot of the criticism and just that big idea of so many changes could take place in a 2,500 year period. Okay, that seems plausible to me. But almost no changes took place in a 1,000 year period that we were able to discover. So the Jews must have been meticulously careful in the transmission of these texts. So if we look at that 1,000 year period and say, well, there was no changes in that period because they were so careful with it, then is it reasonable to say then the 1,500 years even before that, we could assume that they were going to be as careful with it too? I think so. So I know that's a long story to go through, but one of the big arguments that really undermines a lot of people's faith is that argument right there that, well, if there was that big of a distance between there, then there's no way we could have confidence in it. And I think the Dead Sea Scrolls really shot down that argument in a lot of ways, because what we find is there weren't major changes. It stayed the same.
Yeah, and just a couple of things to add to that. One thing is, one of the reasons why the King James translators did not have older texts than the 1000 AD one was because when a text would wear out in a synagogue, they would destroy it and they would write a new one. So you use a text for 100 years and you've unrolled Isaiah for 100 years, and now all of a sudden it's raggedy and worn out. Well, instead of just putting that in a storage closet and writing a new one, they would destroy that old one because they didn't want a raggedy copy of Isaiah. They thought that it was I think the idea was that it was almost disrespectful to the text for it just to lay around looking raggedy. And so they would just create a brand new one. Well, if you do that, you get to keep nice, clean copies of Isaiah, but you don't have the old ones to compare it to. So that was one thing. And then another thing is, you've heard of the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Now, there were lots of copies of the Septuagint available, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it was translated in about 285 BC, right? So even though we didn't have manuscript copies of the Hebrew Old Testament, we had translations, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that we could compare that Masoretic text, that 1000 AD one, to that. And I think sometimes the Septuagint helps us because it shows us. So the translators of the Septuagint were working with a copy that was up to date at their time. And so we can compare that. And so those are a couple of things maybe that help explain why there's that big gap. So let's think about just any questions about that with the Old Testament? Another thing is you can actually see the scribes who copied the Old Testament were very conscientious men. And that's part of the reason why we can have such confidence in the New Testament is because there is this scribal tradition handed down from the people who'd been copying the Old Testament. And they would actually create grids on their papyrus, on their scroll, so that they could outline and see, so that if they missed a letter, if they were off, they would know. Well, that's pretty precise, you know. When I try to take notes, you know, in class or something like that, and I'm writing down, man, there's so many things I've messed up and missed. See, I can't
messed up.
I can't messed up and messed it. But what they were doing is they were trying to create fail safes in order to protect themselves from. Well, why would they be so careful about such a thing? Because they believe this is the word of the living God. And so I think that helps us. So when we think about the New Testament, the beauty of the New Testament is that we have so many copies, and there are some there's some wonderful benefits that come from that. But then that opens up to some criticism. You've heard the Gettysburg Address before. I know this seems unrelated. 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth in Scott. Okay. Do you know we don't have the original Gettysburg Address? And yet I was made to memorize the Gettysburg Address in the 6th grade. And I don't really think that's fair, because how do we ever know what was actually said? Because we didn't have the original. All we have are 5 copies that were made by some of Lincoln's secretaries and newspaper reporters that were present at Gettysburg on that day. And you know, not one of them matched perfectly. So how can we possibly know we'll see, that's silly. Because we can know pretty close what Abraham Lincoln said. So if he had a V here or an A here, maybe we don't have that. But the essence, the tone, the content of what he said, we can know, even though we have 5 copies. And so let's say we only had 1 copy. It wasn't Lincoln's original. It was just a secretary wrote down 1 copy. You know, I think they would always be kind of lingering in the back of people's mind. Well, maybe this guy just made that up. Maybe this is not actually what Lincoln said.
Maybe he missed a whole paragraph.
Maybe he missed a whole paragraph. We have no idea. But the fact we have 5 copies actually benefits us, because we can look at each one of those and we can say, okay, they all agree on this. So that must have absolutely been in there. And they all agree on this. Now, there's a little question here, but 4 of the 5 say this, and the other one you can easily explain. Like he said, he misspelled the word united, right? Like, so you can figure out that what he said was United States. So I don't even know if it says United States in the thing, actually. But you understand what I'm saying. Maybe he misspelled a word.
Maybe he spelled for F-O-R-E.
Yeah, that's
Four
right.
score.
Yeah, that's right. He used the British spelling or something.
Yeah.
So anyway, my point is that so nobody would say, well, we can know what the Declaration of Independence said because we have the original, but we can't know what the Gettysburg Address says because we don't have the original. You see what I'm saying? So the first thing we have to establish is we don't have the originals of the New Testament. And Bart Ehrman, who is probably the most famous critic of the New Testament, he says he just blows students' minds when they come to his New Testament class and he says, well, did you know we don't even have the original copies? And he says that students from evangelical denominations all over the place just say, what? You know, we don't have, well, I want to disabuse anybody that we don't have the original copies. We don't have the original manuscripts. And like you said, what we probably have are copies of copies of copies. But does that mean we can't trust them? And I don't think that's true. Another thing Bart Ehrman says, and this is where he will scare folks, is he will say there are between 200,000 and 400,000 variants in the manuscripts that we do have. So let me define the word manuscript. When I say manuscript, I'm talking about a handwritten copy from before the time of the printing press. Right, that's what these scholars mean when they talk about a manuscript. So here's somebody who has a copy of Luke or Mark or something sitting in front of them, and they make a handwritten copy of that, and we found it. That's what we call a manuscript. So 200,000 to 400,000 variations. This is Ehrman's famous line. He will say, there are more variations in the New Testament manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Yikes. That's scary, right? That there are more changes in. All right, so two things I think that kind of, well, actually there's several things that kind of mitigate that. First of all, the number of manuscripts we have. There are about 5,700 Greek manuscripts, handwritten Greek manuscripts from before the printing press of the New Testament. 5,700. That's a lot. I mean, in order to tell you how much that is, so Tacitus, that was a historian from 56 to 120 AD, we have 3 surviving manuscripts of him. Thucydides, we have 20, and that's pretty good. You know, to have 20 of an ancient historian is pretty good. So if you had a historical author and you had 15 manuscripts, you stack them up, that'd be about a stack about 4 feet high. If you have the stack of New Testament manuscripts, if they were stacked up, they would be 1.25 miles high. That's how many manuscripts we have of the New Testament, which is an incredible number. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means we got a lot of variations. Because anytime somebody makes an error, that's going to be a variant, right? And so,
and when we say
ahead.
error,
that's
it can be anything. But if it is, they forgot to put an E in this word.
Misspelled word, word order, right? Anything like that is what they're calling a variant or a variation. And let me say this. So let's say we only had 2 copies of Mark, right? 2 copies of the Gospel of Mark. How many variations could there possibly be? Not that many, right? But if we have 200 copies of Mark, right, then the opportunities for variations increase. So Bar Ehrman wants to scare you and say there's 400,000 variations. Yeah, but we've got nearly 6,000 different manuscripts. And in addition to that, the number that he's counting is translation manuscripts and quotation manuscripts. So let's say I'm in a sermon and I've got my sermon outline written and I'm accidentally mistype the verse in my sermon. Well, the early church fathers, they would write their sermons out like that. And if they made a mistake, Ehrman's counting that as one of his variants. Like, we can't know what's really said because they misquoted this here. So that's number 1. Number 2, yes. So, Mark Twain has the line, there's lies, dirty lies, and statistics. So I'm not disagreeing with his 400,000 or 200,000 to 400,000 number. I'm not disagreeing with that number. What I'm disagreeing with is what that number should mean to us. So first of all, we got all these variations. The second thing, all these manuscripts. The second thing is what counts as a variation? Misspelled words, word order. So 99.9% of the variations that are in these manuscripts are either meaningless, right? It's spelled there, T-H-E-I-R, instead of T-H-Y'-R-E, right? Which they didn't because they were writing Greek, and that's English. But you understand what I'm saying. Or they are impossible, right? Meaningless or impossible. So let's say we have 50 copies of 1 Peter. And in 1 Peter 3:21, somebody wrote, baptism does not now save us. That's not meaningless, right? Like that would change the meaning. But if we have 49 copies that say baptism does save us, and 1 copy that says does not, we'd say, okay, that's not a meaningless variation, but it's an impossible variation. That's not what it says because we have all these copies that get it this other way. And those are the kind of things that happen. So 99% are meaningless or they're impossible. And we'll talk about the others in just a second. But all I want to do with that is, and here's another thing. So let's say you've got 10 copies of a manuscript and one of them misspells a word. So we got 10 copies of Luke and one of them misspells Theophilus, which is an easy thing to do, right? One of them misspells Theophilus. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 variants. You see that? If 9 of them get it right, but one of them misses it, then all of them count as variants, including, you see what I'm saying? So that reduces that number to almost meaningless.
So when Ehrman says that there are more variants than there are words in the New Testament, Timmy went, "What? How would that work?"
Yeah.
That's how that works.
That's right.
And you get to count. You get them count multiple times. So
it's not untrue that there are all those variants if they define what variance means. It is untrue that should make the New Testament unreliable. What we have is we just have one scholar called it an embarrassment of riches with all the manuscripts we have. We have so many that when we do see variations, we're not surprised by that because human people are making the copies, right? They're not Xerox machines. They're fallible human beings. But what we have is we're able to compare all of those different copies. And if I make a mistake, it doesn't mean that now we've lost what the original text was, because there are hundreds of other copies of that very same thing that kind of serve as a check and balance on my mistake. I hope this is making sense. I don't want to be too deep in the woods, but I hope it's clear.
Do y'all have any questions or anything about maybe anything we've said so far that you'd like us either to muddy the waters more on or try to clarify? All right. So going back to what I was talking about earlier is, can we have reasonable confidence in the Scripture? So you mentioned a couple of texts there. Did anybody study the Odyssey or the Iliad in school? Did y'all go to school? No. All right. No. So I remember studying the Odyssey in literature class, and or maybe it was the Iliad. I'm not sure which one it was. Maybe it's both. I don't know. Anyway, and I don't ever remember my teacher saying, really, we have no idea what Homer wrote. And even though Homer, as far as we know, maybe didn't write anything, it was passed down orally, and then later somebody wrote it, and then we don't have the original, whoever wrote it. It was a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and yet when we read that, now I do get that there is a difference, in our mind at least, between what Homer wrote in the Odyssey and the Iliad and what we take to be God's Word. So, you know what? If they left a paragraph out of the Odyssey, probably doesn't ruin the story for me. Probably doesn't affect my life very much. If there's something missing in God's Word that's God needed for me to know, then that is serious. And so I get why there's a higher criticism on the Bible. I really do. But I don't think it's fair to look at the Bible and say, we can have no idea what was originally written by Paul or Peter or any of the original authors. When we look at the rest of works from antiquity and say, well, we have confidence. Let me give you just a few other. Do you have the statistics on the Odyssey and the Iliad? Homer's
I don't.
Okay, I meant to write down and I forgot to. But so Herodias wrote his work in 58 to 50 BC. All right, so we're looking, about 60 years before Christ on that. We have five manuscripts to go off of on that. The earliest of those 5 manuscripts were 950 AD. 900 years after Herodias said these things, wrote these things, we have the earliest manuscript. We only have 5. Most people don't question what Herodias taught and wrote. Aristotle, 343 BC, 5 manuscripts. The earliest, 1100 AD. So you're talking 1400 years afterwards, after he wrote it, the first manuscript we have. Only have 5 copies. Nobody has a big problem with that. New Testament, written between 50 and 95 AD. Over 20,000 manuscripts. You see the difference there? 20,000. The earliest that we have is around 100 AD. We're talking, 5 years between the end of the Old Testament and the earliest manuscript we have. And we have 20,000 different things to compare that to and to look and see and see. So you were talking about an embarrassment of riches. It's overwhelming, the confidence when it comes to works of antiquity, the amount of confidence that we can have in the New Testament transmission. Matter of fact, there's no work in antiquity that even comes close to having such a traceable, being able to trace the transmission of the text, like the New Testament in particular. The Old Testament, not quite. It's older, so there's not quite as much, but there's still plenty there, I think. So anyway, looking at that and understanding that is one of the things that when I first became a Christian, I was kind of blown away by some of these things like Bart Ehrman would suggest. And I started looking at that. I started to say, wait a minute. If I can go through life and say, well, I'm pretty sure that George Washington was president of the United States, I'm pretty sure of these other things. Why am I pretty sure on that? Because I can look back and say that there was this historian and maybe a number of historians who reported the same thing, wrote those down. We have copies of that. And I look at that and I say, yeah, I believe that George Washington really lived. I believe George Washington really did those things. Well, that's how we determine anything in history, and ancient history in particular. And so when we look at the Bible, do we have confidence that those things were preserved for us in the right form? And I think we can have more confidence of that than anything else in antiquity.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that the gap for other historical authors from the ancient world is at best, 600, 700, 800 years. From the time that they wrote it to the earliest copy we have, it's hundreds of years. For the New Testament, we're talking about tens of years, right? Maybe singles of years, but at the most, we're talking about decades, not centuries. The other thing is that it's not just that we have copies of books, but within the first couple of hundred years, we have full copies of the New Testament, right? That we can just look at and see the whole thing. So in comparison with other works of ancient history, there is no question about the authenticity of the New Testament. So let me illustrate this. So Bart Ehrman, his most famous book, probably his most famous book, is called Misquoting Jesus. And in that book, he argues that the New Testament authors, the New Testament scribes, the people who are copying it, were not really capable men, that there's all these variants, all of that. So they put out a paperback edition. He had sold millions of copies. That's what happens when you say something that the national media likes. You become a New York Times bestseller if you can challenge what Jesus said and all that sort of thing. So it becomes a New York Times bestseller, sells millions of copies. So they put out a paperback edition. And in the back of that paperback edition, they put a question and answer session that they had with Bart Ehrman. Did I say Bruce Metzger? I didn't mean to. He was a student of a guy named Bruce Metzger. He was at Princeton Theological Seminary. Bruce Metzger was probably the top textual expert on the text of the New Testament from the 20th century. And Bart Ehrman was his student. And the interviewer asked him, they said, why have you come to the conclusion that we cannot trust what the New Testament teaches about its fundamental cardinal doctrines? And he said, actually, I don't think that anything that I've said has put any New Testament doctrine in question. In other words, he doesn't believe all this stuff, but he does not believe that any of his criticisms put any New Testament doctrine in question. In other words, all of the variants and the mistakes, so-called, that he sees in the scriptures, in the copies of these scriptures, he says don't affect the foundational beliefs of Christianity at all. I would say not only do they not affect the significant ones, they don't affect anything, right? They don't change anything about what the New Testament teaches. So that's a pretty big, what would you say, confession from someone who does not believe in the New Testament, but would say there's no New Testament doctrine that's in question as a result of this. So I think that's helpful to me to know that the foremost critic of the New Testament's copying would say, we know basically what the text says, even when he throws out that big scary number of 200 to 400,000. He's being honest enough to say, but things like the divinity of Jesus and things like heaven and hell, like these things are not in question when we look at the New Testament. Any questions at this point? Anything that would be, maybe you don't even know the questions to ask because we've made such a mess of it. But.
Yeah, so again, Larson was talking about taking somebody else's word for it. Obviously, I haven't gone through and looked at all the variants and all that, but taking the word from somebody who has, my understanding is out of the variants, 99.9% of our New Testament is pure, undisputed in that. 99.9%. So the 0.1% that is under dispute is mostly trivial. And you think, whoa, if it's a variant, how can it be trivial? Well, it's something like a misspelling or a word placement or a word that's left out, omitted, but it doesn't change the meaning at all. I really just know of 3 texts that are a little bit troublesome to me, and really in those texts, no matter which variant I choose, it really doesn't change anything, because the rest of the Bible fills out a full enough picture that I still know what to believe about that. But one of them we talked about last Bible class, John 5, verse 8, where you have a section that is in some text but not in other texts there. Mark 16, the passage that talks about whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Whoever does not believe will be condemned. All right, so that's not in
that whole section from like verse 9 to verse 20.
Yes,
it's not just verse 16, but that whole paragraph is questioned by some.
Yes. All right, so now let's take that one. So let's say I'm talking to somebody about baptism, and I said, well, look what Mark chapter 16, verse 16 says. And they turn over there and they look at it and they say, well, my Bible doesn't say that. My Bible doesn't have that in there. Does that mean that you don't have to be baptized to be saved? Yeah,
passages.
Yeah,
a dozen or more.
A dozen or more other passages that you could look at and see the same thing. So that's one of those that it bothers me that that's not in all manuscripts there. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know where the weight of the evidence is, whether it should be in there or whether that was added by somebody in the margins of one manuscript that got copied in other places. I don't know which way it falls on that. So that does bother me a little bit. But fundamentally, does it change anything? And the answer is no, it doesn't, because I have multiple other scriptures that talk about what baptism is, what one has to do to be saved, and so forth, so that it doesn't change anything whichever way it goes. And then the third one is John chapter 8. And again, it doesn't change anything. But those are the only 3 passages, for me personally, that I've come across where there's a variant in different manuscripts that I look at and I go, I wish I knew exactly which one it was. But whichever variant I would accept doesn't really change anything about what I believe or what the Scripture teaches, because of all the other information that we have in the New Testament.
Yeah, so I've looked some at. There was a time in my life where I was studying Mark a lot, and so I wanted to see if I could come to some confidence on Mark 16. And I came to the point where I thought that we could reasonably say that Mark 16, 9 through 20 was there. But that's probably not where I would stake my argument for baptism with somebody. Just because, if you've got an English standard, it's going to put verse 9 to 20 in a bracket and say, later manuscripts add this section. Now, I think what they're doing is they're assuming that they know what the original was, and they're saying later manuscripts add it. And I might say, well, early manuscripts omitted it. Right? Like maybe it was actually there, and an earlier manuscript just. And I think it's easy to explain how that's missing. One of the copies for Mark that they say explains that it was missing was being used as kindling for a fire. Right? So that's not exactly a reliable place to look and say, well, this is going to be the definitive copy of Mark we're going to use. So that's part of it. As you may mention with John 8, it's the story of Jesus forgiving the adulterous woman. Have we ever seen Jesus in any other setting forgive somebody who was guilty of a pretty serious sin? Yeah. So it's not as if we lose that passage, now all of a sudden we don't know that Jesus would forgive people of sexual sin. Right? Like that is typical of Jesus. Actually, that very passage, it's not that it's missing in manuscripts; it's that it shows up in different places. There's one that it's in the book of Luke, one that it's just included between Luke and John. So it's as if they were aware of it; they just didn't know where it was supposed to go, and so maybe it's original. Let me just say this. So sometimes we'll be reading in Bible class, and if somebody's using a more modern translation, and you're reading like a King James Version or New King James, you'll notice that I leave out a passage that I'm reading. And usually, well, my Bible has this verse next. Or if I'm reading out of the King James and you have a modern translation, I'll read something and say, well, that's not in my Bible. Well, what happened? When the King James Version translators were translating, they had 2 manuscripts they were working from. Two manuscripts. So this was 500 years ago, right? 400 years ago. 400 and a little. They had two manuscripts they were working from. And so in the time since 1611, the other 5,000 manuscripts we have been discovered. And so what they're suggesting is that these offer a little bit more clarity about what the earliest text looks like. Very often, the things that are missing or changed are just like repetitions. You see this a lot in the Gospels, where Mark's account will have it phrased one way, Matthew's account will have it phrased a different way, and in the King James, they're almost made to match. And then in newer translations, they're not. Well, why is it? Well, you can imagine a scribe copying down the same story and remembering how Matthew said it and just almost writing that by memory. And so it's easy to explain maybe why some of these differences show up.
Kind of like a preacher who preaches from one
That's right.
version for a while
That's
and
right.
then swaps. When I swapped from the King James to the New King James,
Yeah.
I was reading from the New King James. What was coming out of my mouth was the King James, because that's what I had preached for a number of years. And so a scribe writing, had just copied Matthew. Now he's copying Luke, and similar story, and he could make the mistake.
That's right. So with Mark 16:9 through 20, there are a couple of good books out there on that subject, but if you want to read more about that, then I can point you in that direction. I think there's good reason to accept them. The 1 John 5:8 one is a little different. Erasmus, who was the first person to put together a full Greek New Testament manuscript. Well, I don't know if it was the first one, but it was the first one to be compiled, and it was pretty much what the King James translators used. He was working from the Latin Vulgate, which was the first translation of the Greek, first major translation. The Catholic Church commissioned the Vulgate. This may be more than you wanted to know, but I'm going to tell you anyway. And Erasmus wanted to create an authentic, genuine, trustworthy copy of the Greek New Testament. Because I don't want to be working from a translation. I want the original language so that people can start from there instead of having to start from a translation. And so as he was working through, he had a lot of questions about 1 John 5:8. If you remember, it's the passage that says there are three that testify in heaven, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which is a great passage if you want to prove the Trinity. But Erasmus had a lot of questions. He just could not find this in any of the manuscripts that he had access to. And so he put out a challenge. And he said, if anybody can find a manuscript that includes this, I will use it. He's like, but as of right now, I'm leaving it out. Well, evidently somebody produced one. And what I mean produced is he had questions even about the authenticity of this manuscript that they were producing. So it got included. And later editions, later copies of 1 John have shown, probably wasn't in the original. Now, does that mean that the concept of the Trinity doesn't show up anywhere in Scripture? No. I mean, it's just all over the place, right? I think it might very well be on the very first page of the Bible. Let us make man in our own image. Something's going on there. You have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit at Jesus' baptism, all pictured there. So it's not that it throws the question of the Trinity in doubt. It's that we just want to know what the text originally said. And maybe of all the places where there are questions, I think that might be a good one, that there may actually be a question. Boy, that's a lot of stuff. Any comments that you guys have? Questions?
I can tell by y'all's expressions, y'all would like to take a full semester of this.
So let's combine this with what we said last week. Last week, I think we came to the conclusion that what we can know is that we have the books that God intended us to have. Now, one thing I didn't say last week that I think is important. Why is it so important for them to figure out which books are the ones to believe that these are the inspired ones? Well, when the Roman government says, if you don't get rid of those books, I'm going to kill you, you want to be very clear on which books you're allowed to, or which books are worth dying for and which books aren't. Like if I got a copy of the Gospel of Thomas, I'm not dying for it, right? But something else, maybe I would be willing to stake my life. And so you want to be very clear on what the books are. Why does it matter whether or not we know what's being said? Why did they care about being precise with copying the text? Because they believe this is worth dying for. So these scribes are going to be very careful. And from what we can tell, and obviously this is getting beyond my knowledge, But what we can tell by looking at the copies of these manuscripts is that the scribes who are copying them are careful, they are trained, they are meticulous. And do you know the reason that we carry any book really, but the reason our Bibles are bound like this and not like a scroll is because of the earliest Christian scribes as they're copying their New Testaments, because they wanted a way to be able to carry all four Gospels together. And there was no way to create a scroll that would do that. And so what they did is they created the book. They called it a codex. And so that they could write on both sides and fold it together and put it in a binding to protect it. And so they were using the best technology. That was not Jewish, that was not Greek, that was not Roman. It was invented by Christians trying to transmit the Scriptures. There are similar patterns that scribes, wherever they're from, whenever they're making copies, they use the same abbreviations, they use the same, so various different things that indicate they have a very orderly, conscientious process to make sure the copies are being made carefully. It's not like it's just a bunch of untrained men going out there and just writing copies. They're being very careful. Why? Because they believe it's worth being careful with. They believe it's worth protecting.
Y'all have anything else? Any questions or comments or statements? Well, I've about exhausted what I know about that.
I've gone beyond what I know about it. I've just said stuff that I'm not quite sure about. Next week, we want to look at translations. I don't know if it'll be next week, but the next time we do this, maybe look at translations. How do we know what a good translation is? What are translations trying to do? What's the best translation, or what are some good translations? And how might we use different translations together? Maybe is there a place for using the Message versus using, the American Standard or whatever else we've got? So those are questions that I have and that I've had along the way, and I think would be worth thinking about for us. Hopefully you're seeing that we can trust what we've got. That you can be an educated, intelligent person and still believe in the Bible. That you don't have to check your brain at the door. That the atheists don't have the monopoly on intelligence or on accuracy or anything like that. That we can make a claim to having a reasonable, well-reasoned, well-thought-out faith. So anyway, appreciate your willingness to come and spend time on a Sunday afternoon like this and talk about these things.
And even if you don't find it incredibly fascinating,
yeah,
you do need to at least hear that information at least once, just to have an idea of, well, why is it that people make these arguments, and why is it that we can have confidence in it?
Yeah, so when you say Barn Ehrman show up on whatever news channel you're watching, and he says, well, there's 400,000 variants, you can say, well, I know that. I know where that number's coming from. And I know that that's not all it's cracked up to be. And you can say, we have the earliest and most manuscripts of the New Testament that we do of any ancient document. So if we can trust anything from ancient history, we can trust the New Testament. And that's kind of your elevator speech. If somebody jumps on the elevator and says, you can't trust the New Testament, you say, actually, we have more copies and earlier copies of the New Testament than we do any other ancient document. So if we can know what any ancient historian says, we can trust the New Testament. And then they get off the elevator and they're a changed person.
That's right. So. In 3 floors. Thank y'all. Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.